On today's Locked On Canadiens, what can the Habs learn from the Stanley Cup winning Florida Panthers?
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1134. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is Laura Sab, also known as The Active Stick, and today I'm not joined by my wonderful co-host Ian Boisvert, or maybe it's Ian. I'm instead joined by Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers, and without further ado, here is our crossover edition where we touched on a lot of stuff, especially what the Habs can learn from the Florida Panthers as they rebuild and head towards a Stanley Cup.
And welcome into this crossover edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Montreal Canadiens podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Thank you for making both of our Locked On podcasts your first listen of the day. For everyone on the Habs feed, let me introduce myself. My name is Armando Velez, the host of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, and very thankful to be doing this crossover edition, another divisional crossover edition here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, this time doing it with one of the co-hosts of Locked On Canadiens, Laura Saba. Laura, great to be connecting with you on another crossover, another off-season crossover that we are doing here.
I want to first of all say thank you so much for having me on the crossover. I have a lot of questions for the host who's covering a Stanley Cup winning team as the Canadiens move closer to that. I really, really do appreciate the time. I did really want to quickly mention, though, for our listeners that Ian and I have prepared a tribute to Johnny and Matthew Gaudreau, and we have an extensive segment planned on that for our next episode. Obviously, at this time, I just want to share my condolences to the family, the friends, and the fans of these two young players who were, a young player and a coach, two young men who were so senselessly killed on Friday or Thursday evening. And I just wanted to say that, and we will be talking more extensively about that, but I just wanted to make sure that it's acknowledged right off the top of this episode. And we will be talking more about it. And I'm just so sorry for it.
Yeah. And same here. And we will have a separate episode here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, just talk about Johnny Gaudreau and what he meant to the world of hockey. And no easy transition here with this one, but Johnny Gaudreau's former teammate in Patrik Laine was traded to the Montreal Canadiens just a few weeks ago. And it's crazy to think that what happened with Montreal and the state of the rebuild, guys have taken that next step for them. Nick Suzuki took that next step, Yaroslav Slavkovsky, and now adding this to the top six with the Montreal Canadiens, projected to be on that second line with Kirby Dach and Alex Newhook. When you first heard about the trade for Patrik Laine, Laura, what was the reaction around Habs land?
Everybody was elated. There were some pauses. There's always that guy that doesn't like it, right? But for me, like, what I really appreciated was that the Canadiens went really bold with this, right? And speaking of bold, there are his pants that I can't get over. Patrik Laine is such a character. But most of all, I think everybody kind of realized that Kent Hughes did this not just to be bold, not just to be out there, but really it was well thought out. It was researched, right? Like, they talked about how they spoke to the team. They spoke to Patrik himself. It was kind of a little bit unusual because the Columbus Blue Jackets allowed them to talk to medical professionals, people surrounding Patrik Laine. So they really did their homework. It's not just like a splash, right? It was a well thought out splash. And the key thing is, you mentioned, players taking a step forward. Kent Hughes mentioned this as a reward for the guys that have worked hard to get better. So from my perspective, it was a surprise, particularly since we'd heard in the media a couple weeks before that the Habs had absolutely no interest, right? And it's true that they might not have had an interest at that time, But Kent Hughes always knows. August, Kent Hughes always makes a splash, and this time it was a big one. I think this one it's really going to change the trajectory of this team in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and with Patrik Laine coming into the mix, multiple 40 goal score for him, and also what the Habs gave up for Laine, or the lack thereof of what to give up for him, which Montreal still gets a second round pick in it, and then there's a little bit of a logjam in defense with a lot of left-handed defensemen uh, there for Montreal, and then Jordan Harris, one of the guys going over there to Columbus, is going to get more playing time over there for another team that's kind of rebuilding over there for them. And then you think about just also the highlights obviously for the Canadiens are their forwards of guys who've taken their next step, but also veteran guys like a Mike Matheson being on the top defense pair and quarterback in that power play, and also Sam Montembeault getting an extension for him too. So it's also for me looking at some former Panthers, great to see that they're taking their next step, and then also guys like Kirby Dach, who had a lot of injuries last year, was a top 3 pick for the Chicago Blackhawks, and now for him hoping to bounce back after a really great first season in Montreal too, after going there too. So for Montreal, it really seems for them that this could be that next step for guys who are going to have their contracts expire in a few years. And with taking his full cap hit, it doesn't seem that's like something that's going to be a big dent because of what's coming up with like LTIR with Carey Price and what I'm seeing on Puckpedia, Raphael Harvey Pinard. So there's still some flexibility there in short term and long term.
Yeah, and so Kent Hughes has mentioned that he expects to be cap compliant without having to use LTIR before the season starts. So that's interesting to see how he's going to maneuver that. It means he's got some other stuff up his sleeve, or there's going to be some paper transactions. I'm not really sure, but he did seem it did seem like he's still cooking, right? So that's the big thing. But I'm glad you mentioned both of those players, actually, the former Florida Panthers in Samuel Montembeault and in Mike Matheson, because I feel that sometimes, we talk about change of scenery as a cliche, but sometimes it is really truly what you need. And sometimes a change in scenery doesn't necessarily mean, oh, like he's out of that situation. It's more like, oh, he's playing with a different set of players, or he's playing under a different coach, and it's maybe somebody who's a better fit. In terms of Samuel Montembeault, I thought it was really interesting in that he was an afterthought, right? Like he was claimed off waivers, and then he really he did the most to grab that opportunity by the horns, and now he is the number one goaltender in the Montreal Canadiens organization, for better or worse. That's who he is, right? So I think it's really interesting. Whereas with Mike Matheson, he had a breakout year this year. Well, not a breakout. I guess what would you call it? A breakout is more, I guess, suited to rookies. But he had his best year, I would say. He had a phenomenal year. And I think it's really, really interesting that him too, like he essentially took what he was given and made the most out of it. He played so many minutes. He was very heavily relied upon, but he did the most with that. He scored a lot of points, and I think a lot of times his production is kind of underrated in Montreal. But Jordan Harris, to your point as well, he was a player that in Montreal, he was not going to get an opportunity to go any higher than third pair, whereas I believe his potential is more second pair. I'm not going to say he's going to be your number 1 defenseman or your number 2 defenseman, but your number 4 defenseman, that definitely is a possibility. So he really needed that opportunity to prove it. So it's a good situation for him. Unfortunately, what's going on there, it's going to be a tough year for everybody in Columbus. But I think the Canadiens, they ate the cap hit, so they got a reward for it in that second round pick. Also, you did point out all these guys' contracts are going to be up a couple of seasons from now. Yes, when the Montreal Canadiens are like contenders, these guys might not be here, but the journey is for sure going to be fun. Like what they bring to the team, Laine, Matheson, even Samuel Montembeault might not be here. What they bring to the team right now is so promising, and it's so helpful for the young core that we do expect to be around 2-3 years from now.
Yeah, and then some of the guys who aren't as highlighted as other guys, Caden Gooley getting an extension for them too. There, and also I noticed something. I remember doing this crossover last year, and discussing only one guy who played all 82 games last season, and Nick Suzuki, and this year having 4 of them. So health has been on the side of the Montreal Canadiens as they were starting to build. I don't always, you can't always point to record as always the what it says about a rebuild too, but also for what's coming up for them in Ivan Dadonov, David Reinbacher. Now that his ELC has started this year, obviously Dadonov is going to have another year out in Russia before he comes over for him. So that's another thing for that. Health is on their side, and also another part of Laine's line, Alex Newhook. He also had a career high with not having to carry a big load like he was trying to in Colorado there too. So looks like that with what Marty St. Louis is trying to put together, Kent Hughes and everything that for Montreal, everyone is going to get a chance too. That's the great thing about rebuilds sometimes.
Yeah, and that's it. Everybody's going to get a chance to prove themselves. Everybody's going to get a chance to play. Everybody's going to get a chance to do what's necessary, right? Like, and that's what I'm so excited about.
Yeah, no doubt. But we're going to transition over to segment number 2, where we're going to flip it over to Laura, where she's going to ask me any of her Florida Panthers related questions for myself in relation to the Montreal Canadiens. We're going to discuss that more next here on Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Montreal Canadiens. But first, let us tell you all about FanDuel. And you've all heard us talk about it, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet up to $5 and get a 3 weeks free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. You can cancel anytime. So just visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you guys once again for making Locked On Florida Panthers and Locked On Montreal Canadiens podcast your first listen of the day. As now we switch it over to Laura Saba for any questions she has in relation to the Florida Panthers. The floor is yours.
The first question is, can we have Matthew Tkachuk? That's my first question. No, all right. So here's what my question for you is really the Montreal Canadiens, as you know, are in a rebuild. As we know, the Florida Panthers got to the Stanley Cup final last year, and then this year finally won the thing. As somebody who has seen now 2 finals and come out of the on the winning side of one of them, like, that's the holy grail. Like, that's what all the players are playing for. And you look at a rebuilding team like Montreal. What, if you were the GM, what kind of advice would you give a guy like Kent Hughes if he's trying to get to the Stanley Cup and become a contender?
Well, a few of them is one of them is going to be very simplistic about just having an open door policy, talking to your players and everything, just be able to just hear everyone out when it comes to that. Also, just another one is identify #1 center, which the Montreal Canadiens do have in Nick Suzuki there. So that's a great thing that they have there. And also just a coach who's willing to learn and be a player's guy. I mean, you think about Marty St. Louis and just the career that he's had. We talk about undersized guys. I mean, having one in Cole Caulfield for the Montreal Canadiens. That's one that a lot of people talk about when it comes to him. So that you think about when it comes to just guys who are just able to grind things out, identify that. And for Marty St. Louis in his journey, that's definitely one that is a guy who just understands and has been through it all, and eventually winning the Stanley Cup for him. So he knows there's going to be a lot of bad days in the rebuild. I mean, two straight years of getting the fifth overall pick, 3 years ago getting #1. I mean, and to think that three wins away for Montreal from winning the Stanley Cup in 2021. So you think about just the 180 that's going on there, but then relationships, I mean, I know you guys spoke ad nauseum about Dominic Ducharme and the relationships or lack thereof there after the Stanley Cup final, and just how quickly things just turn south for them there. So it's just always be able to just communicate with your players, and also you get really it comes down to just getting guys on the cheap and getting guys who want to be there. Obviously, there's guys on the ELCs, but also guys who are willing to take less to be part of a contender. But that for the Canadiens won't come until a little later. I mean, we saw it with the Florida Panthers with getting guys like Joe Thornton recently, even though it was for 1 year for them. The Stahl brothers for the Panthers, even though they're on the team that lost in the Stanley Cup final in 2023. And then we have stopgaps in the year after in Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Anthony Stolarz. It's about really identifying those guys and seeing maybe guys who weren't given the best chance in a certain situation, which going back to Patrik Laine in this situation and trying to just see where they can elevate. But the thing is, going back to the Canadiens, Patrik Laine is proven in what he can do on the offensive side of the puck too. So there's also that proven part for him. But it's just one player out of 20 guys who are dressed every single night. So it's really about consistently finding those other guys along with him.
So I think it's really interesting what you said about an open door policy, because I don't know if Kent Hughes necessarily has that specifically, but he has a very honest and open relationship with his players. As for Marty, he's definitely got an open door policy. Like he's, he's that guy that everybody, the players would run through a wall for. And I love that about him. But I want to ask you specifically, like we're talking about, like it's 20 guys, it's not just one guy, but how much of a difference did the trade for Matthew Tkachuk, how much of a difference did bringing him in make for Florida in a short amount of time?
Oh man, it everything for him, because you think about just what the Panthers needed for when they were eliminated in 2022 in that sweep against the Tampa Bay Lightning, and then Matthew Tkachuk coming in and then just bringing more of that physicality, the guy who's going to bang you around the boards to who's going to get in front of the goalie's face, get him mad. I mean, first season with the Florida Panthers, I mean, Matthew Tkachuk and Jonathan Quick go at it a little bit, and then Matthew Tkachuk gets suspended for obviously something that was a little boneheaded at the time from his part, but also someone who's just gonna just upset you. I mean, Chris Kreider in the Eastern Conference Final in Game 4 got him so upset, and Chris Kreider's a really calm dude to the point that he tried chucking his mouthpiece over the glass there. So it's been such a big difference for Matthew Tkachuk coming in, and just and it's also when it came to his first season and getting all those points for the Florida Panthers, and then the very next year not having as much of the point production for him. His shots were down, but still he was still making plays on the power play. I mean, Sam Reinhart took that next step, even that for him, even though he was scoring 30 goals in multiple seasons. But when someone takes a step back for the Panthers, another guy has been able to elevate their game. Carter Verhaeghe, he was a 40 goal scorer the year before. Didn't score 40 this year, but we know he's capable of doing that. So it's about different guys taking turns for them to get the production. But also it's really how the Florida Panthers were able to just focus on defense first and being tight. I mean, best road penalty kill in the regular season that carried over to the postseason as far as what they've done there. So
What's
it's really
that
about it's pretty great, especially going into hostile environments. Hey, Montreal is one of them. It's I don't say the original 6 for Montreal. It's the original 1 if you were talking history, if we're talking NHL history there. But for the Florida Panthers being able to go into different environments and kill penalties and not having to rely on last change, it's been great to see what they can do.
I think that's actually really, really interesting, because obviously right now the defense doesn't really have an identity, right? Like there's all these guys jockeying for spots. There's 2 guys that for sure aren't going to be there a couple of years from now, right? And then there's all these and even the players who are looking for spots. There's more players than there will be spots when the team contends. But that penalty kill is just so important, because it's one of the elements that could lose you a game, right?
Mhm.
Or win you a game. And I find that with the Montreal Canadiens, they really need to do something about it because they have not, they actually, it got a lot better after the All-Star game last season. They were actually for like a stretch of time, I don't know if it was like 4 weeks or 5 weeks, they're actually the number one penalty kill in the NHL. But not overall, right? Just that particular stretch. So like they went from like being like the last or the second last in the NHL to like, somewhere to middle of the pack based on that average alone. That's how good they were for like a short amount of time. But like I think it's so key to have that consistency and to be able to know that when there is there is a penalty, that your team can kill it off, right? Like it's a lot of penalty killing is goaltending too, which I did want to really quickly ask you about just before we go to our next segment. So goaltending in Florida has been inconsistent historically. So how much of a difference did it make this year in your mind?
It's crazy because when you think about this year specifically, I mean, Sergei Bobrovsky's number didn't really stick out too much in the regular season. I mean, Anthony Stolarz was the better one in the smaller sample size for him. I mean, when we talk about unsung heroes for the Florida Panthers in that last season, Anthony Stolarz is definitely up there for multiple, especially road shutouts too. Very two great performances, especially that stick out for me, are one on the road in Nashville and then another one on the road in Buffalo last year for him. But it's going to be crazy to think that what the next phase of goaltending is going to be with Spencer Knight coming back into the mix after his time in players' assistants and having a great year in the AHL for Charlotte too. So they also got to see what he's going to be. But also for Sergei Bobrovsky, he didn't have to carry as much of the load this year as he did in the 2023 postseason. It was Sergei Bobrovsky was the hands down Conn Smythe leader for the Florida Panthers going into the 2023 Stanley Cup final. This year, it was Sergei Bobrovsky or Alexander Barkov, one of the two. But then obviously Connor McDavid just set not right. He didn't set records for the postseason, but he got into a certain echelon of 40 points in a postseason. Something we hadn't seen in more than 30 years too. So for that, I mean, hey, the Panthers will take the cup, even though they didn't get a Conn Smythe winner for them. But for Bobrovsky, 2 more years left on his contract. Obviously, there was a comparison between him and Carey Price, the two biggest cap hits as far as goaltenders. But with Sergei, rough start for him in Florida, and then
I
bouncing back and
remember.
actually and finally getting the cup. And for him doing it at a later age and doing it at 35, I mean, it's really satisfying. I'm sure for him to finally get his moment.
Absolutely. And I think now it's time for us to move to our next segment where there's some predictions at play.
Yes, and we'll discuss that more on this crossover edition of Locked On Panthers and on Montreal Canadiens. Third and final segment here on this crossover edition of Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Montreal Canadiens podcast. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Canadiens your first listen of the day. So, when obviously we spoke about a little bit about both of our teams, Panthers getting the cup, next phase of what's going to happen after that for them, Montreal going through their rebuild. So, I there were some odds that I did look at for the Habs plus 2,200 to win the Stanley Cup for the Habs there. So it's
Maybe I should put some money on them.
maybe who knows, but I was talking about this with Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley of Locked On Red Wings. They spoke about not only the Atlantic Division, how hard it is, how the top part of it, but really how improved the other teams are for them. Obviously, I really like the direction the Ottawa Senators are actually going with their offseason. Buffalo's still wait and see for them. Detroit is take a little bit of a step back, pay your guys that you have to now, and then reset everything in the offseason. So and Steve Yzerman not committing to playoffs for them. But with Laine, and we spoke about the draft or where they were slotted in the last 3 years. So now with this, Laura, I got to ask you, what is the floor for the Habs this season?
I think with trading for Laine, before trading for Laine, like I would have said easily middle of the pack, right? You know, that no man's land where you don't draft high and you don't make the playoffs, that nobody wants to end up there. But that's where I thought they would end up. But now with trading for Laine, I think Kent Hughes is sending a message, not just that, but also giving us an opportunity. He said he didn't do it for this reason, like to give an opportunity for a young defenseman. But we all know that that's what the consequence of this Jordan Harris being traded away thing is. I think the floor has to be wild card. I think if you ask Kent Hughes, he wants them to make the playoffs now. This is him being serious and saying, okay, it's time. It's time to make the playoffs. How far they'll go in the playoffs, that's a big question. I think really, like we've been debating on our show, and our listeners have been really upset with us because we said we'd rather have a top 3 pick than a 4-game sweep in the playoffs. Some people might prefer that 4-game sweep in the playoffs, and I don't know. With the Panthers, it was only 2 years away from a Stanley Cup, so for me, the floor is wild card. Like whatever happens after that, like I think the expectation for the Habs is like they are going to seize a wild card from. Obviously, like they're expecting that Detroit's not going to go much further. Buffalo's not going to be that much of a threat, right? Like they're really competing with teams like Washington or the Penguins or even I'm going to say Ottawa, but I like what Ottawa's done in terms of their goaltending, but I don't really think that they've really transformed their lineup all that much. Whereas with the Canadiens, like they made one move and they've transformed their lineup entirely, right? That question of depth there. And obviously assuming that Kirby Dach stays healthy and Patrik Laine stays healthy, then it's got to be the wild card spot.
Yeah, and I think of in the example of the Senators, the fact that they have GM and coach in place. Now it's just for them players. You guys have to be the ones to prove it. Now it's no longer this constant turnover. Obviously, there's some stability, at least in my opinion, in Montreal with what they're going through next with what's going on in the rebuild. But not only Atlantic, but you mentioned some of the teams in the Metropolitan that they're going to be battling for a wild card. Watching him as improved a lot with the other guy that Patrik Laine was traded for in Pierre-Luc Dubois, adding in Jacob Chikrin, Matt Roy, excuse me, Philadelphia. I think this is gonna be their real tank year for them. I still don't know where to put Pittsburgh. I still don't know for them. It's really hard. They're the hardest one to predict. And for the Islanders, I don't believe Sorokin will have another horrid season like he had last year. And they're now under a full season of Patrick Waugh, former Habs. The penalty kill for New York will definitely be much improved for them. And for Montreal, I think it's funny because I'm actually in agreement with the whole I rather be in the postseason and get swept over the top 3 pick. And here's why. And
Yeah, our listeners are going to love you.
Here's why. When you're rebuilding and when it comes to timelines of rebuilding, sometimes there comes a certain point where you just want to get out of the basement and give a glimmer of hope. And I think a top 3 pick would say that there's so many things that would have to go wrong and that going into an off season would just bring more questions while there's still, even though, and looking at Montreal's the draft, how many draft picks they have, 2 in the first round, 2 in the second, 3 in the third, 2 in the fourth. There's still opportunities to still make great to make maybe a splash trade if you need to, even if you make the playoffs. So I'm on the whole, I'm on the make the postseason over the top 3 pick. But I will make a prediction though. I don't think the Montreal Canadiens will finish last in the Atlantic. I don't think they will. I think but I don't think they'll make the playoffs neither. But I will say they will finish above Buffalo this year in the postseason. That is the one team that I will say they will finish over in the Atlantic Division standings.
So do you think it's the quality of competition that will be the downfall?
More than likely, but it won't paint the numbers won't paint the whole picture, in my opinion, on growth and the ability and for these guys of getting a year older into a new system and then guys who are going to come up. I didn't even mention Floridian Jacob Fowler, who's playing at Boston College. And you mentioned Sam Montembeault might not even be part of the mix in a couple of years, even though he got his extension. So that part of the pipeline for Montreal, what I'm seeing is actually very strong too in goal. So for that next phase of guys who are they're trying to build around too. So that's another thing for guys who are gonna get younger, and I mentioned with guys wanting to come to Florida with Montreal, if there's signs of that of progress, along with having 3 guys who are signed long term, four, this could be the Atlantic Division version, possibly, of the New Jersey Devils, of getting that having so many young guys who could take that next step and getting the complementary pieces, because Florida for the longest time they had Huberdeau, Barkov under 6-year deals. So what was going to be the next step? They brought in Yager for part of the mix in 2016, but then fell off after. So and then constant turnover in coaching. There's not a turnover in coaching with Montreal. The guys are signed for 8 years. So continuity is important. So if guys from the outside are going to see that the continuity there, along with the coach and along with the history of the Habs, who knows? In 2 or 3 years, that could be their chance to finally open a championship window.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think their window is quite far. It's still, there's still a few years for that, and it's interesting that you bring up New Jersey, because I thought, I forgot New Jersey when I was saying like competition for the wild card. For me, I think it's really just a matter of, this is the message that Kent Hughes has sent, and I don't have any reason to believe that if everyone stays healthy, and that's a big if, right? Kirby Dach was out, like he played a game and a half, if that, right? But with these guys, like you have your top line already set, and then you've got depth now with that second line. Like you've got actual threats, right? So I think that's a big thing, and I do really feel that this year, one defenseman who's currently slotted to play in the AHL, if not playing in the AHL already, is going to have a big year and really make a splash. Like in my mind, it's Lane Hudson. But I don't really know, like, if that works. But I think, for the Habs, if they don't at least challenge for a wild card, it's going to be a big disappointment. And if they do get a wild card spot, like, I don't think it's going to be one where like management's going to say, okay, you can pat yourselves on the back and you're done now. Like, it's going to be like more, the pressure will be higher, not lower.
Oh man, and the pressure from the fan base, that's gonna be fun to watch if that results in a postseason and what's to come after,
Yeah.
too. Because hey, we all want our team to win, right? So you see one little itty bit of success, you just assume.
Want more.
You just want more, but it's not always linear for sure. But Laura, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this crossover edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. I'm grateful to do once again another show with you. Tell my listeners where they can follow you online.
So you can find me at The Active Stick. You can find my co-host Ian at Maybe It's Ian, and our podcast is at LO_Canadiens. We're also available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, just like you're listening to and watching now.
Awesome. And for the Habs listeners, you can follow me on X at Monoman12. Follow the show account on X and Instagram at LO_FLA Panthers. And also check out both of our tweets during some future Montreal Canadiens and Florida Panthers matchups. Laura, thank you once again, and I will see you again very soon.
Thank you so much.